Orthodox Survival Course by Father Seraphim Rose and Father Podmashinsky. Lecture 12, Part 2. Music. About music, we won't go into too much detail. It's too long a topic. But it's enough to mention one great historian of Western music, Alfred Frankenstein, who died some years ago. And he's an expert in the Baroque period, the Classical period, the Romantic period, the medieval music. He's written, I believe, a long textbook of Western music. And when he comes to the 20th century, he says, "With this I end my history of music." You get in Scriabin a terrible kind of ecstatic music, which is some kind of screeching. And beyond that, Father H. What did he write? Father S. He wrote a sort of black mass, actually. Father Seraphim. Musical black mass? And beyond this, you can't go in the old idioms of European music. And so they began these frightful experiments. The 12-tone system, Schoenberg and his frightful operas. He wrote Verklarte Nacht, when the people are screeching at each other for hours on end. And it's obviously meant to put you in a crazy house. But it's this very sort of thing that expresses the period. Expressionistic, you know. These German expressionists with their screaming people and frightful horrors. Expresses the same kind of feelings. And from that time on, there's all these experiments. Like now, where there's concertos for tape, 3 tape recorders, playing simultaneously forwards and backwards at 5 different speeds. And all these ideas that hurly-churly chant sounds will produce some kind of new wonder. There's even a textbook of music. It's called Music Since Debussy, in which he says that the age right now produces no music which is worth anything, because it's all experimentation. Out of all this experimentation, perhaps there will come a new golden age, like the age of Bach and Handel, once all these experiments have been finished. And probably it's something to say, something true there, because mankind has gotten used to all these things, and therefore it's possible to reconstruct, if a person is a genius, to take all these elements of disorder and come up with some new kind of harmony. And there's already a new harmony which will express the feelings of the people, and will be for Antichrist. And in fact, Thomas Mann has already written a novel about that. Thomas Mann. Well, we'll say one word about Thomas Mann. He's probably the only great novelist the 20th century produced. Mann. He died in 1955 at the age of 80. He was in exile from Germany during the reign of Hitler. Politically, he's very boring. He's a Democrat. And looks for the reconstruction of humanity after totalitarianism has passed. But in his art, he's very sensitive, more like a German. He goes very deep. You may recall in one of his books, he talks about young students talking together all night long. They're talking about what is reality, what is truth. Is there life after death? And in the middle of it they say, "You know, I bet we Germans are the only people in the world, except for the Russians, who do this kind of thing." Just talking all night about what's real and what isn't real. And he wrote several novels which reflect this, from the point of view of an artist looking at the whole of society, reflecting on what is going on. He's not a nihilist. He's a humanist who has a very positive outlook on life. But he writes about some of these movements, and sometimes very, very profoundly. He wrote a book called The Magic Mountain, one of his best books, which is a description of life in a tuberculosis asylum, clinic in the mountains of Switzerland. And this is supposed to be an allegory of modern European history at the end of the First World War, either the end or the beginning. Anyway, just in the dawn of our own day. And this is a peculiar kind of place where everybody has all kinds of strange philosophies, which means all the different conflicting philosophies of Europe. And everybody who comes there gets sick, because Europe is sick. It's sort of a parable of everybody who comes in contact with Western civilization absorbs this sickness. You can't escape it. And the place where they're supposed to be curing, that is Europe, has the ability, the idea that we are the ones who know everything. We are going to cure you with our enlightenment. But you go there, you get mixed up with Europe, and you get sick yourself. No matter how you try, you don't get cured. Nobody goes back alive. They're sort of all killed off by this thing. In fact, you cannot even go there. You cannot visit your relatives in this place without getting sick, and you have to stay there. You're stuck. In other words, they have no other philosophy of life to overcome this sickness of Europe. In fact, there's one very interesting scene where they go to the movies, and Thomas Mann gives his perceptions about the film, that the film is a very abnormal thing, a horrible thing, because what is sacred to man, his own image, is captured, put independently on a screen, and then acts in spite of you, and you're hopeless, you're helpless. And the image goes on acting from then on. It's as though a part of your soul has been taken away from you, and he can sit back and watch himself as though he's just kind of a separate being. He gives his sort of feelings from natural human sense, because he was there at the beginning of motion pictures, 1920s. In Germany there was the great flowering of movies. He had a frightful feeling about movies, that it's something demonic. And he says the whole thing is very abnormal, makes him feel very uneasy to see these ghost-like figures on the screen, which have no reality in themselves, only celluloid, some kind of a flickering picture, something that isn't there. And by the way, I had a German professor who had the same feelings about telephones. He said, "I can't stand telephones. Whenever I hear it ring and I pick it up, I get terribly afraid. I hear a voice of somebody 1,000 miles away, and I feel it's demons." It's very interesting how these deep thinkers have feelings like that. And he, Thomas Mann, then goes into things like seances. He deliberately went to a seance to experiment to see if anything happens, and it did. The table moved away from him into the air, or some kind of thing like that. He was persuaded there's some kind of power there. So he has that also as part of this magic mountain. At the end, he has this one very striking scene where someone says, "Let's have a seance. We have somebody here who can conjure spirits." And everybody says, "Oh, wonderful." And most people are sort of joking about it. Well, you can believe in all kinds of things. Why don't we believe in that? Let's try it out. And they all get together, and all of a sudden a spirit begins to grip them, and they see before their eyes some kind of a shape begins to form, to materialize. And when they look, it is the ghost of somebody they all know, a specter. Somebody's father or something all of a sudden appears in front of them all. And they are so frightened by this that it produces a terrible effect upon them. And this is sort of stuck in there with no statement as to why. But we know that Thomas Mann, in his non-fiction writings, was very interested in spiritualism, and went to seances and tested them out and took notes about them, and came away convinced that there is some power at work which produces these various phenomena. And to a Europe which has no philosophy of its own and is sick, this begins to become very attractive. And one of his last novels is called Dr. Faustus, which is a description of a musical genius in the modern idiom, as described by an ordinary young, middle-class student who went to school with this genius. Usually he tells his stories through the third person, who's a typical German middle-class person with average values, German values, cleanliness and precision and study, thrift, and all these wonderful things the Germans are noted for. And he has such a way of presenting his novels when he talks about these, either spiritualism or anything which is very demonic or extraordinary. He has a way of describing it through the eyes of somebody who is completely normal and completely matter-of-fact, so that you're all the more horrified by what comes out. And just like Dostoevsky talked about Ivan Karamazov in his vision of the devil as though it's a hallucination, but still he's getting across a very important point. And so you have this completely normal man whose fellow college student is a student in music. So he describes the career of this musician, this composer, as though he's an ordinary man, very talented, but he seems to have some kind of strange things about him, as though he wants something, that he can't be satisfied with ordinary things. He wants more. And he keeps wondering about this. And he notices after he gets out, he wants to become a great composer. And he produces tremendous. He has some kind of tremendous fits of energy and inspiration. And he comes up with some fantastical new things. He begins composing all kinds of weird things and making up new atonal systems, and 15 notes instead of 8, and all kinds of fantastical new things just because he's driven by some kind of a thing. And finally he produces his masterpiece, which is The Apocalypse. For, I think, 1,000 voices, 1,500 instruments, the most fantastic work of music ever composed. And they actually perform it someplace with 1,000 voices. It shows how the devil sort of gave him this tremendous talent to persuade audiences with this gift of his, on the condition that he sells his soul. And he, the narrator, wonders how he got the inspiration for that. And he manages somehow to observe him at work. And then he discovers that there's someone who comes to pay him a visit, that he's speaking to somebody who isn't there. And during these moments of speaking to someone who isn't there, he gets tremendous inspirations. Begins to open up to him the possibility for going deeper into music and making some kind of musical composition that no one has ever done before. He'll be the greatest composer there ever was. It turns out that it's the devil. He finally sells his soul to the devil in order to gain this ultimate thrill in composing music. And then he gives this to the people, and the people say, "This is wonderful. This is the great pinnacle of modern music. Finally, modern music has achieved its masterpiece." And it's obvious that the man sold his soul to the devil, like Dr. Faustus. He doesn't say this in so many words, but what he describes is exactly the same thing. The man, for the sake of earthly creation, has given away his soul, and the demons invade. So that's another writer who taught, although he's not as profound as Dostoevsky, but nevertheless he's very aware of a lot of these currents of modern thought. So we have seen in this book, Art in Crisis, how this whole phenomenon we've been studying, the revolutionary worldview of modern man, which makes not just the political revolution, the whole new anti-Christian revolution, is something which bursts out not just in the political revolution, and not just in somebody's philosophy, but bursts out quite independently in art and poetry and many other spheres. And it bursts out in art before the revolution. That is, these schemes for the spheres we saw, and Goya's things, well, Goya's first demonic ones before the revolution. So it is not simply being inspired by the political event, it is rather an example of the same force which produced that event is producing also the art. That is, there are inspirations which come undoubtedly from demons. And although we do not see exactly how the demons inspire, it's obvious that this is the work of demons inspiring these artists. And these are not just some kind of crazy people, by the way. It would be very nice if we could say these are crazy people, and not typical at all of ordinary people who we see in the supermarket, and therefore we can forget them. It's the same kind of psychology which tells you that, well, it's all right for Russians or the Vietnamese. They want that kind of government. Let them have it, and we'll just go on. In fact, Solzhenitsyn said yesterday, July 1975, he was in Washington and spoke to a group of senators and congressmen, about 100 of them. And at the end of this he said, "Here in the vast spaces of this continent, it is difficult to believe what is happening in the world. But gentlemen, there is no longer to be any safe life. Neither we nor you will have a safe life. May it happen that God will grant you that when you come to your crisis, you will have such leaders as you had at the beginning of the revolution, who still believed in human nature and did not mock the idea of good and evil." Unfortunately, it so happens that this age of humanism, which produced even America, the Founding Fathers, and the art of that century, is something which is almost like a utopia now. We can't go back to it. That was the age halfway between the old Orthodox age and the new age of chaos and revolution. And for a moment there was some kind of harmony and peace. But the process that had been started was already carrying mankind further. And it so happens that this process is expressed most clearly in the great revolutionaries and the radical philosophers, and these wild artists. And so actually we see in them how the demonic bursts into the world. But if that demonic did not already have control over all the people living in the world, these painters would be forgotten. They would not be known. They would not be held up as the examples of great painters. Their revolutions would die out. There would be nobody to follow them. The fact that the majority of people are of the same mentality are prepared for that which these prophets of the new times they see. That is why we have such a disordered age. And in fact, we can say even the ordinary people who go to the supermarkets and are satisfied with themselves are worse off than these other ones, because the other ones are the ones who are tortured so often. They were rebelling against this everyday supermarket mentality of the people who are, oh, everything's all right, things are going just fine, and the gulag, it doesn't touch me. Those kinds of people drive to fury these people who are really deep. They want something. They want God. And God has been cut off. And so they go to the devil. But the devil has the grip over the whole world, and that's why they stand out. Spiritualism. So this brings us to our next subject, spiritualism and a few more aspects of the disjointed world of our times. This phenomenon of spiritualism is very symptomatic in modern times, in the last 2 centuries in particular. This takes us to the middle of the 19th century, the very time when this art is bursting out with its demonic apparitions. And the year is 1848, which is the exact year of the great revolutions in Europe. As it were, this same demonic power bursts out in one form in the revolutions, in another form all of a sudden begins to make some kind of tappings, which opens up the possibility to communicate with another world. These began in Hydesville, New York, near Rochester. And there were two sisters, Falk sisters, who were able to interpret these knockings. And later on, they went through all kinds of, they were accused, accusations of fraud and deception. And one of the sisters confessed that she had done the knocking with her knuckles or something. Later, she repented that she'd confessed. And one of them became a Catholic nun. And anyway, it doesn't make any difference what happened to them. The fact is that these knockings began to break out, and then the mediums began to take over. And within a very short time, the mediums were going to England. England and America are the two basic centers of spiritualism. They began to form their own church, and to this day there are spiritualist temples all over America and England, and a few outside. This is another case where this practical, everyday Anglo-Saxon mentality, the same mentality also which is behind the dreams of socialism, like Owen, has a very powerful affinity with this mystical side, with spiritualism. Not with true mysticism, not with any kind of true contact with God, but rather with something bound up with an externalization of some kind of mysticism. Because spiritualism is a contact with some other world which does not depend upon how much one has transformed oneself. It only depends upon how much you have educated your mediumistic faculties. Of course, it is required before you believe in spiritualism that you have totally disbelieved in Christianity, have come to believe a very vague kind of Christianity. You no longer know the difference between divine phenomena and demonic phenomena, and you are prepared to accept anything which proves the existence of something supernatural or preternatural as coming from the Spirit. The same mentality as was behind the Pentecostal movement, which develops later in the century. There are many phenomena of this movement. There are tappings, there are sometimes voices. There are apparitions wherein a whole ghost supposedly can be manifested. There are partial manifestations, such as a hand will suddenly appear, and Thomas Mann saw a hand being materialized. There are some things called automatic writing. In fact, I saw one. I once bought a book on spiritualism, and inside there was a sheet of paper with the tiniest handwriting. It was impossible for a human hand to write. Several pages on one page. And it said, and began, and very smooth, it said, "This message is not written by a human hand," and it traces out the message. And we know this is possible because Madame Blavatsky, the founder of Theosophy, was herself an expert at things like materializing dishes. And they would put a piece of paper and lock it inside some kind of dish or some kind of cabinet. And she would concentrate for 10 minutes and then open the cabinet. And there would be something written on the piece of paper which her demons had come to help her and written it down. Sometimes they can even see a pen come out of nowhere and begin writing with no hand behind it. All these are the standard tricks of the devils because they are able to do things like materialize objects and strike people and lift tables. There's a whole technique which is already in our article on the charismatic movement about how they do this. They get together and get some kind of psychic energy by holding hands. And this involves the sphere of the unconscious, the psyche of man, which is a very deep sphere which we don't know too much about. And there's a great deal of energy there which can be channeled. And of course, the main ingredient of these phenomena are the demons themselves who come to the aid of the medium. And a person who is well trained in mediumism has a certain faculty for it, is able to conjure up demons under the state of being in a deep trance. Of course, the reason why this is condemned by God is because this is a very dangerous sphere of spiritual realities which are too much for us. When these realities come to the saints, that is, the demons attack the saints, frightful battles go on. But now mankind has become civilized, and the demons appear under very civilized guises. And they come up with a philosophy which is so stupid and so contradictory, and so much in harmony with what Emerson or somebody else is saying. As soon as communism comes into fashion, then the theosophists start talking like communists, and so forth, just picking up whatever is in the air. And the spirits give you exactly what any old preacher can give you in a spiritualist temple without any spirits, or in any Protestant church for that matter. There's one thing which the spiritualists lay great emphasis upon as a proof of the existence of the spirits. That is the scientific demonstrable fact that whenever the spirits come, the temperature in the room drops several degrees. And they've conducted experiments with thermometers to show that. 3 or 5 degrees, something like that. The temperature drops in the room when the spirits come. Of course, for us that's conclusive proof that these are devils, because the devils are cold, and it comes out even physically. And experiencing a chill in the presence of some kind of demonic phenomenon is not just the imagination. These new powers are those who now are to give mankind a new religion. And no longer is it to be a religion in which man freely gives his soul to God in obedience. Now man is going to be compelled to believe because there are outward proofs which show that there are spirits. Western philosophy had come to the point where no longer did we believe in God or any kind of otherworldly beings. And now, as though from underneath, the spiritual reality comes up. This has made it possible. 3. Leads to scientific approach to religion. Steiner. Extrasensory phenomena, especially parapsychology, well developed in Russian and other communist countries. Affinity of atheistic socialism with occultism, spiritualism. Development of higher senses, higher science. Science must end in spiritualism. Steiner, 54. Saint Simon and Teilhard de Chardin, and others who dreamed about the reconciliation of science and religion. And from this time on there began to be formed societies for the scientific study of spiritual phenomena. In England, there was the Society for Psychical Research, where Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was a leading representative. And here the distinguished agnostics of Victorian England found their way back to spirituality, and they wrote books about it which are so naive and fantastical. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and his Sherlock Holmes detective mentality, pure rationalism, is attracted by spiritualism. The same thing, the practical mind, because the upper reality is closed off. As soon as some kind of spiritual reality enters the realm of phenomena, they fall for it, and they have no standard with which to judge anymore. Father H. Is that the book? Father Seraphim. The Christianity Without Mystery has now given way to actual non-Christianity with mystery. In our own times, we have the various societies for studying extrasensory phenomena. Parapsychology, it's called, at the laboratory of Duke University, Virginia. And this science, incidentally, is extremely well developed in the Soviet Union and also other places like Hungary. because the Soviets are very realistic and open to anything which can be powerful. And since they have found that there is something to extrasensory perception, there are some kind of faculties in the human being which seem to be above our ordinary five senses. Therefore, they're developing them to see if they can't make this into some kind of weapon for warfare, or for making communism more secure, or just for advancing science. There was even an example, unfortunately I've lost the newspaper clipping, but at the Congress of the Communist Party in 1955 or 1956, there was a woman who got up in Moscow and gave her testimony of how Lenin had appeared to her and told her what was to be voted on at the next assembly, the next Communist Party meeting, and it was recorded and simply accepted. In this period also we have another interesting example of someone, an Englishwoman, who has both the socialist and occultist mentality. Miss Anne Besant, who was a women's rights crusader and socialist, who was converted by Madame Blavatsky and became president of the Theosophical Society and ended up by educating the Messiah. That is, the young Indian boy, Krishnamurti, whom at the time he was 4 years old, she proclaimed he was going to be the future Messiah. Her name is Annie Besant, Besant. And finally he grew up and renounced the messiahship, and went around teaching himself. And to this day he teaches. He goes to north of Santa Barbara, there's a camp, Ojai. In Holland there's a place, some kind of summer camp, where he goes and gives lectures, and he writes books, says he's not the Messiah, but he's giving the gospel to the new age. I think he's still alive. Krishnamurti is his name. This is the age also of the founding of the Theosophical Society by Madame Blavatskaya, the Russian medium, who claimed from the very day of her baptism she was the sworn enemy of kings and the church, because when she was baptized, the priest almost burned to death when a candle fell over and burned his robes up. From her very childhood, she had manifested these psychic talents of manifesting objects and so forth. Madame Blavatskaya wrote tremendous big volumes, Isis Unveiled. She taught she thought she was teaching Eastern wisdom, which she got from the masters in Tibet. And there are very tricky means by which she got her revelations. A letter would suddenly be fluttering down into the room. She would read it, and there was the latest revelation from the Mahatmas in India. Father H. Didn't Christian Science come from the same thing? Father Seraphim. And later on in India, when Tibet was already more explored, the Mahatmas moved into outer space, and now they're on some planet. Student. She used to be a circus performer. Father Seraphim. She was a medium. She was definitely a well-developed medium. But there were so many of these phenomena that we can't discuss all of them. There's one of these people involved with these occult movements who is perhaps more interesting than the others. His name is Rudolf Steiner. He was also a theosophist and finally kicked out of the Theosophical Society because he was a little too smart. And so he founded his own society called Anthroposophy, Wisdom of Man. This is his picture. He is rather smarter than most occultists, who are usually extremely naive in that most theosophists and spiritualists usually are extremely shallow, simply open to whatever the spirits tell them. He was a man who was more of a philosopher. He was a great student of Goethe, and found that Goethe was the great mystic of our times who was going to unite religion and science. And he developed a kind of spiritualism which he thought was scientific. That is, he was looking at the whole of reality, both the outward reality which science examines, and the inward reality in which he got his visions. He tried to make some kind of synthesis between them, and his writings are still quite seriously studied by all kinds of serious people. He has founded some schools which are still in existence, which teach things like eurythmy, which is how to move your body and dance in order to somehow acquire spirituality, which seems to give some kind of results. And he has an interesting thing to say about what he was striving for. The scientist contemplates matter as complete in itself without being aware that he is in the presence of spirit reality manifesting itself in material form. He does not know that spirit metamorphoses itself into matter in order to attain to ways of working which are possible only in this metamorphosis. For example, spirit expresses itself through a material brain in order that man may, by the process of conceptual knowledge, attain to free self-consciousness. By means of the brain, man derives spirit out of matter, but the instrument he uses is itself the creation of spirit. And in our days, when science has come to a dead end and doesn't see what matter is, finds that it cannot define matter by itself, he wants to come to the rescue and give them a science which is based upon something higher, that is, on spiritual reality, which he says is verifiable in experience. In fact, the cry of all the theosophists and spiritualists is, try it yourself. You can be convinced by your own experience if you follow the rules for getting in contact with spirits. Of course, this is against the freedom of Christianity, which is the fact that you have faith in God and give up yourself to God, who is above you, out of free choice, and not because it's been proved to you, but because you are in contact with some kind of reality which forces itself upon you. Of course, all this spiritualistic phenomena results, just like modern art, with which it has much in common. In fact, many of these artists have very occult ideas, result in the same kind of a disjointed, fragmentary world where all beings all of a sudden pop out of some kind of space. A hand appears all of a sudden. You can materialize objects. You can materialize some kind of ghosts. And this is it's very strange to the normal enlightened mind. And this is very much strange to the normal enlightened modern attitude of material reality. I didn't mention here all the cults and so forth, which came as a result of this idea of Kant, that the self, the mind, is the center of the universe. But there are a lot of them, from Mormonism, the idea that you can now trust your revelations that come to you. And the 19th century is full of people who trusted whatever kind of impressions came to them and made a new religion, like Mary Baker Eddy made the Christian Science, and Ellen Wise made the Seventh-day Adventists. William Miller, also a Seventh-day Adventist, and went out and started the Jehovah's Witnesses. All of them based sort of on the fact that they themselves are like a god who has a new revelation, and everybody follows them. But here's one that happened to be in a magazine here, and one of these cults which calls itself Hindu. Actually, it's Hindu for an American scene. It's the magazine of the Hare Krishna movement, which is in full color, very impressive. It's called Back to Godhead. Of course, we see here where the self-centered Western philosophy hooks up with Hinduism. This movement began in the 19th century, because in Hinduism you become God. See, You can meditate, chant, and you get into this state where God enters into you. And therefore you literally become a god. Yourself becomes a god. It fits very nicely. Hinduism is just right with the whole philosophy of evolution, with Nietzsche and all the rest. But it's the combination of Hinduism and these other philosophies. You can see that when it's in India, I don't know, it's just plain paganism. But when it's on American soil, it fits in with our self-centered, pampered mentality. It's very sensuous. Here you see these young people, Miss America or American boys who shave their heads, put on these robes and look like representatives of the new religion. And they're all happy and joyous and chanting. And here's their God, who's very inspiring, isn't he? The great prophet. He died a year or two ago. And then there's all kinds of various articles and tapes, transcendental sounds. You listen to these sounds. Golden Avatar tape subscription. You get to listen to all kinds of sounds which bring up your mind into the heavenly realms. You know, talk about all kinds of contemporary subjects like science. They invite you to have feasts, a full-course yoga meal, and share chanting with them. There's some kind of ancient text they translate, and news items. And then in the theater they have Bhagavad Gita in the form of a play, and all dressed up for hours. They make themselves up in these costumes, stand in front of the mirrors. And when they dance, it looks very sensuous and happy, and looks like they're a little bit sexually off. They sort of get a thrill out of this, shaving their heads and looking like a bunch of weirdos. And they lose themselves in meditating and chanting. Remember, in our Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future, we described their temple in San Francisco, how they just stand there for hours. They're beating the drums and beating the drums and beating the drums. And all around the walls there's these pictures from the Bhagavad Gita, these sensuous kinds of costumes, silky kind of robes. You get into the real state in which you are not present at all. It's like being on drugs. Take a look at these costumes they have. And then these fantastical stories, because nowadays we like science fiction and space fantasies and so forth. So here's a whole story about the boar who battled for planet Earth. And you get a whole fantasy story about a cosmic pig who wants to devour Earth. That takes care of your fantasy needs. This is like Brahma. He's greater than all the heavens. So this boar also is much bigger than the earth. He could swallow the earth up if he wanted to. That's the ancient paganism which comes right back into our temporary life. But in the very kind of a self-centered and sensuous, and it's obvious all this, incense and the chanting, the costumes, and you take off your Western clothes and put on these robes, and makes you feel very important, very part of the new, and it's all self-centered. It's adapted to American needs. And this man here, this is the head, the one who is their guru or their avatar. He was just an ordinary businessman in India. He didn't have any future there at all. He came to America and discovered that here he can make his living at kind of being like a god to all these people. But Americans now are reduced, because those who do not consciously wake up to what Christianity is and begin to see that in the world there's tremendous evil fighting for souls, could easily fall into these traps. And therefore those who don't fall for Hare Krishna fall for some other kind of movement, and various kinds of even Protestant, Father H. Sometimes they fall for Orthodoxy with all the icons and the incense, Father Seraphim also, Father H., and the canons and all that business. You give them the whole thing, no exceptions. Father Seraphim. Therefore, there has to be a criticism. There has to be an awareness of what is what. What is our religion based on? So there's two big things fighting. One is true Christianity, orthodoxy, and the other is this new philosophy which most people are not even aware of. Most people who go for the contemporary beat, rock and roll, or various kinds of modern culture, art, music, and religion, they aren't particularly aware that they're part of this movement. They just go over to it because that's what's in the air. People around them are doing it, they feel a need for it, and they follow without being conscious of it. But we who are studying this have to be conscious of what's going on. Any questions on all this so far? Is it clear what the combination of ideas, is producing? Hume destroys external reality. Kant restores the self as the center of reality, mind or the self as the center of reality, and then this becomes the new God. This is the new God. The old God is dead. Father H. But for those who are not Orthodox, those who are not keeping, not protecting orthodoxy. Father S. Those who just go along with the times, whatever is in the air. Father H. Right. Student. Do you think Kant knocked over, knew this philosophy, that it would progress the way it has? Father Seraphim. Well, probably. Probably, yeah. Because he's sort of, you can see, he's actually sort of just expressing the philosophy of it. And that element was already there. Therefore, it probably would have gone anyway. He expresses this, and so you can see that this is sort of the underlying philosophy of what we are having. Because in himself, he's not, I would say he's less. He's not influential in the sense that people read him and got these ideas. Rather, he's symptomatic, expresses what's in the air. So that's one aspect. Again, there's another aspect which is revealed. We just got this magazine just as we are talking about the subject, about empowering the self. They seem to be very good people. These scientists called the Spiritual Counterfeits Project in Berkeley. They are some kind of fundamentalists who talk about all kinds of aspects of fake spirituality. And almost everything they write is good. They expose the Maharishi and Scientology and all these cults, everything which is not basic Christianity. They have a whole series of articles on the self, cosmic humanism, or human potential. See, that's also self-centered. The human potential movement which is now in our times. They are coming from psychoanalysis and so forth. He talks about several movements here which may be very symptomatic. Yes, one talks about the human potential movement, and he says that some of the basis of, as a condition to faith in human reason, a new view of humanity contributes to the belief in self-transformation. This human potential emphasizing what I can, how I can develop myself, how I can discover something better. Our culture traditionally embraces a Christian view of people as limited creatures, separate from God. Creatures who are a curious, paradoxical mix of good and evil qualities. That view is now being challenged by an Eastern occult concept of humanity implicit in the human potential movement. The basic tenet of this occult worldview is that all is one. The world of matter, the world of spirit, these are the same essence. If all is one, then differences are illusory. Reality is not what appears to this myriad objects, persons, thoughts, ideas of God, morality, or beauty. What appears is merely subjective to each person. The reality is a unity beyond appearance. You can see Hume Kant. Then it's only a short step to the conclusion that one creates one's own reality. That is, one perceives what one desires to perceive. Those perceptions are not accurate or inaccurate. They are merely part of the illusion of reality beyond which lies oneness, which is the real reality. If all is one, a person's existence as part of that oneness is as sacred and powerful as any other part of the whole. God then becomes part of the unity, of which each individual is a manifestation. As persons break out of the grip of illusion, which is reality as perceived in the material world, godlike transcendence, an experience of oneness with the universe may be experienced. The height of the hierarchy of human needs is the experience of oneness with all things. Persons, in essence, become God. Patients who are being psychoanalyzed have within themselves the answers to their own problems. Within Christianity, you come with problems, and we give you the answers. This is what God commands. You change your life in accordance. According to the new idea, and psychoanalysis is full of that, you have the answers within yourself. Let's work them out. Let's see what your needs are, and how we can express your needs. Student: that's sort of on line with Scientology, isn't it? Father Seraphim: Yeah, it's one of these cults. The same, exactly the same thing. The therapist merely provides a climate of acceptance which enables the person to discover those answers from within. Unlocking universal human wisdom in an individual traditionally has been the role of the shaman or occult priest. Now becomes the work of the psychotherapist. So that's definitely self-worship. You make your own reality, and the new reality comes out from within yourself. And if you have some kind of perversions within yourself, then you have to see how you can express them in some way that's not too difficult for society to accept. Whether it's right or wrong, they don't say anything. The psychoanalyst does not tell you you are right or wrong. If you give them anything, he's going to give you a value system. He has to be scientific. Therefore, you have to work it out from within yourself. Therefore, their assumptions are that humanity is good, that man naturally moves towards growth, that all the right values are already inside the individual, don't come from outside, that human potential is unlimited, that most important thing is experience, that you are autonomous, all by yourself. The goal is personal awareness, and as far as the outside world is concerned, everything is relative. You don't know whether there's God, there isn't any God. The only absolute is change, and there's no evil. All the good comes from within the individual. With that set of presuppositions about the nature of humanity, God, and the world, humanistic psychology became the soil in which the human potential movement has flowered. The cultural climate of the 1960s was perfect for this. By the 1970s, a human potential movement spreading eastward from California had spawned 8,000 different therapies, a system of odds and ends for psychoanalysis, Eastern religions, sexual experimentation, game playing, and old-time revivalism. There was one called transactional analysis, an early influential manifestation of human potential thinking. There's a book called I'm Okay, You're Okay. It was Everything's Just Fine the Way It Is. I recall when I was studying Zen, that was the thing that was emphasized. That Zen just accepts reality the way it is, doesn't add any values to it, Just accept the way it is, just the way you are. Just let loose, let go, and God will take over. If you believe in God or the cosmic mind, just relax, take it easy, and let nature come out. The individual is good and should follow his own experience. I'm okay. Therefore, I do not need to follow any structure or values imposed from without, to free myself from my parent or conscience. It's an idea that you've been under the tyranny of your parents all this time, and now you ought to wake up and become an independent, autonomous personality. Well, that fits in because a teenager likes to rebel, wants to assert himself as an individual, and therefore reject the parent, which is the same thing as the conscience, and listen to my own desires, believe them to be good. This will result in my growth and the realization of my full potential. The transactional analysis textbooks asks one to pick up a mirror twice in the day, look into it, and declare, I'm okay, just the way I am. I'm perfect. This concludes the reading of Lecture 12 of the Orthodox Survival Course by Father Seraphim Rose and Father Pod Mashinsky. Be sure to like, share, subscribe, and comment below, and click the notification bell to be notified of future videos or posts. And you can look into my Patreon page in the description below, as well as my social media. Thank you, and God bless.